I want to use this video to present an idea that I had come across when I was reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a theory that I hadn't really seen presented anywhere else, and it very much falls in line with the rest of his content, and I think it tracks well across his philosophy. Now, I do have to say that I am by no means a philosophical expert. Principally, I'm a 22-year-old kid who thinks he has an aptitude for philosophical insights. Nevertheless, I think I came across something in this book that struck me as quite inconsistent for Nietzschean philosophy, and really I could only assume that Nietzsche was presenting something consistent if this theory that I'm putting forth is true. I believe that Zarathustra, the main character in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, actually was consciously lying about the overman that he was purporting to teach. Now, I'm not going to be so arrogant as to believe that I could critique Nietzsche. However, this striking consistency stood out to me that I believe that it's something that Nietzsche would have criticized out of someone else's work. He put forth early in his writings on Thus Spoke Zarathustra this idea of otherworldliness. This otherworldliness was the basis for the values of religious systems such as Christianity. This otherworldliness critique is the same one that atheists such as Sam Harris put forth against religion. In a nutshell, otherworldliness in Nietzsche's eyes was the focus on an afterlife that existed separately from the physical world which we exist in now. This caused the adherents of these religions to forego a love and care for the world that we currently live in. To give a good analogy of this, imagine if you are living in a home and you have been promised that if you take good care of the garden, then you will be rewarded with a beautiful home that you need not work in, or something along those lines. Well, because you are hyper-focused on a singular aspect of your current living situation, you can afford to care little to none about the rest of the house, because you've been promised a better one for completing this specific task. And you are more than likely to let the rest of your house fall apart because you have no reason to invest in it. Now, if we imagine this problem, or this critique in the arena of religion, you can see why this otherworldliness would pose a problem. Now, Nietzsche very clearly outlined this issue with religious systems. However, he was someone who was clearly aware of what the dissolution of these systems would produce, mainly the nihilistic movements that we saw in the 20th century. I believe the primary reason why these nihilistic systems pervaded common thought and common minds throughout the 20th century was because mankind is not a creature that actually likes attaining something. And it's very counterintuitive. But instead he finds much of his joy and pleasure out of the continual progress towards a goal in which he cannot argue its value. A goal in which it has value that is more or less self-evident. This goal, in many people's eyes, had been proven to be false, and this is what Nietzsche meant when he said, "God is dead, God remains dead." Now, our goal as a species was heaven, or other versions of this otherworldly perfection, and with the death of God, our aspirations for this otherworldly perfection followed him to his grave. The only thing that we had available to us to grab for that could have possibly replaced God was the perfection of our own material status here on earth. But this was another fatal flaw in the thinking that pervaded the 20th century, and one that Nietzsche was very weary of mankind falling into with certain totalitarian movements, mainly the communist movement, which aimed to usher in utopia if only a certain vision of equality and equity could come into fruition. Now these two states of mind, the otherworldly aspirations that allow us to forget the earth, and the insistence of refining our material existence to a state of perfection to offset our suffering, were untenable positions, essentially. And Nietzsche knew this and set out to provide another option for man to set his sights on. Now, with all this in mind, Nietzsche aimed to present us with the idea of the overman, an eventual form of mankind in which he would no longer be bound to the dogma of the times and the rule of the mob, and instead would have the ability and responsibility to create his own values, and by extension create values for man. Here's where we find this inconsistency I alluded to earlier. This overman, from a psychological perspective, would act in the exact same manner as the otherworldly goal which he previously criticized. Continually, the way that the Overman is presented in Nietzsche's view is as an eventual form that mankind can take, in that those men who are currently living have the responsibility to act as a bridge to the Overman, yet they would be incapable of actually becoming Overmen themselves. Even Nietzsche, with his extraordinarily elevated ego, couldn't conceptualize himself as this Overman. Now, the reason I see this vision as inconsistent is because Nietzsche seemed to have accepted the fact that we must posit a goal that is, in essence, beyond the lifetime of those he's positing it for. That the proper aim of those living today is still one that is beyond their death. This is, at least in part, what he criticized about the otherworldliness of religion. Now, it wasn't just otherworldliness in a physical sense, but also in a temporal one. There's not much difference psychologically between a different physical world altogether and the same physical world, but at a point in time which you are no longer consciously able to observe it. In essence, the goal that Nietzsche put forward to replace God and heaven looked eerily similar to that which he wanted to replace. Now, after reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the only way I was able to reconcile this inconsistency in a way that would properly track across Nietzschean philosophy, as I understand it, would be to posit this idea of Nietzsche's conscious lie of the Overman. Now, Nietzsche realized that mankind had lost his goal, and in the same step had lost the motive force that allowed him to strive. But he had also lost this motive force due to a realization of a truth that, when acted on, would culminate into a self-destructive tendency. Now, if we take the idea of truth from a utilitarian perspective, I believe it makes this picture I'm trying to paint a little clearer. Let's say you're handling a firearm. It's a very clear set of rules and understanding that need to be present in order to have, in order to safely handle such a firearm without accidental discharge, let's say. Now, in order to instill a proper sense that allows us to be safe on handling firearms, there's a technical lie that is propagated throughout the firearm community. That lie being the statement, every firearm is always loaded. Now, the reason this lie continues to persist is because it's useful to live as though it is true. If you think that every gun you could handle is always loaded, then you will always treat your handling of that weapon with a higher degree of care than you normally would if you allowed yourself to assume that a gun might not be loaded. So in this sense, in this utilitarian sense, it is more true to say that all guns are loaded, because that, in the final analysis, is a more useful statement to believe. It's in this same dynamic that Nietzsche posited the goal of the Overman, not because he believed it to be true, but because he believed that it would be useful to live as though such a goal was attainable, and such a goal was true. Now, I believe the reason why Nietzsche painted such a picture as a new potential goal for mankind was to set up a goal that corrected the issue of otherworldliness, the issue being the relinquishing of responsibility over our own lives in our own world. So within the frame of the Overman, we could work here and now meaningfully towards that end. However, this vision also intrinsically encapsulates our world as one that is not perfect and has its flaws, and those flaws only have our strength of will that could be set against them, which is something that the utopian movements first sought to replace religion with, continually failed to recognize.
Now, why is it important to make this distinction that the Overman was conceptualized primarily as a lie? Well, Thus Spoke Zarathustra was arguably one of Nietzsche's most favored works. And the language that he uses in his writing is very much indicative of him coming from a place of genuine love and care for mankind. But he makes it clear that this love does not come from pity. He does not lament people's suffering. Nietzsche has a very unorthodox view of suffering, but that seems like a topic for another video. The particular style of writing that he portrays was aimed to once again provide the motive force that comes out of art and literature that was created by minds that were very much theologically and spiritually inspired, but to recast that motive force in a vision that future secular populations could be able to take and believe in once again. Now, for myself personally, as I read this book, coming out of a theological background myself, it very much felt like I was reading the Bible once again, because I was being presented with something that made sense to me on a level that was deeper than empirical. but it didn't have the dry, unappealing characteristics that much of the atheistic work and literature inevitably seems to have. I think the reason for this lack of inexplicable depths within secular thought and works is because of the strict adherence to a type of thinking and style that discounts anything that isn't empirically or scientifically driven. But when you discount everything that isn't one of these things, you find that there is a lot of beauty and art and fine things of life that are cast aside as being without value. And that was something that Nietzsche was very much trying to recapture again in his vision. And I think he did a great job. He certainly did a good job for me, and this has been one of my favorite pieces to read so far.